The ER nurse asked if I knew the incoming patients. I looked at the names on the chart and said, "Yes, prep 2 rooms." My name is Elaine, and at 40 years old, I am the chief attending trauma surgeon at St. Jude Memorial Hospital. I have spent 2 decades staring into open chest cavities, repairing shattered bones, and making split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death. But as I stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the trauma bay on a freezing Tuesday evening, staring at the double ambulance dispatch notice on my tablet, my heart rate didn't spike because of the medical complexity. It spiked because of 2 names listed under the primary trauma codes, Arthur and Evelyn, my parents. For as long as I can remember, my existence in my parents' home was defined not by who I was, but by how invisible I could make myself. I was the eldest daughter, born into a family that had reserved every drop of its warmth, pride, and financial resources for a boy who arrived 4 years after me. My younger brother, Trevor, was the center of our household's universe. If Trevor breathed, my parents organized a celebration. If Trevor played a recreational sport, my father bought high-end equipment and canceled business trips to sit in the front row. I, on the other hand, was the background noise. I was the quiet, reliable child who was expected to cook her own meals, manage her own homework, and stay out of the way while the real star of the family was being nurtured. When I earned a full academic scholarship to an Ivy League university at 18, my mother didn't throw a dinner party. She didn't hug me. She looked up from folding Trevor's travel basketball jerseys, nodded once, and asked if I could drive Trevor to his practice before I started packing my bags. I spent my entire youth believing that if I just worked harder, achieved more, and became someone impossible to ignore, my parents would finally look at me with the same beaming pride they reserved exclusively for Trevor. I bled for my accomplishments. I pulled 80-hour workweeks in undergraduate studies, maintained a perfect grade point average, and survived the brutal, soul-crushing gauntlet of medical school applications. I did it all without a single dollar of financial support from my parents, who were busy refinancing their home to pay for Trevor's 3rd attempts at luxury business ventures and country club memberships. The moment the illusion completely shattered, the exact day the desperate child inside me finally died, happened 15 years ago. It was the day of my medical school graduation. I had spent 4 years starving on instant noodles, working midnight shifts in the anatomy lab, and pushing myself to the absolute edge of physical collapse. I graduated at the very top of my medical class, earning the prestigious distinction of Chief Student Marshal. On the morning of the ceremony, 2 seats were reserved in the front row of the grand auditorium, clearly marked with my family's name. I had pressed my dark blue academic gown, pinned my honors ribbon to my lapel, and waited near the backstage entrance, my hands trembling with excitement. An hour before I was scheduled to walk across the stage and take the Hippocratic oath, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a voice message filled with pride or affection. It was a single, cold line. "We can't make it to the ceremony. Trevor has a championship Little League playoff game across town today, and your father is assistant coaching. We'll celebrate some other time." They skipped the absolute pinnacle of my young life, the culmination of 4 years of relentless labor, to sit on wooden bleachers and watch a 12-year-old play recreational baseball. I stood in the backstage hallway, surrounded by my classmates who were hugging their parents, taking photos, and wiping away tears of collective pride. I stood there completely alone, holding my phone, watching the screen dim to black. No one came for me. No one sat in those reserved seats. When my name was called over the loudspeaker and I walked across that stage to receive my doctorate in medicine, I looked out into the crowd of hundreds of cheering families and saw 2 empty chairs right in the front row. That was the exact moment I chose myself over the people who shared my blood. I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that you cannot earn love from people who view you merely as an inconvenience. Blood doesn't make you family. It just makes you related. I didn't scream. I didn't send a furious text message. I walked out of that auditorium, threw my cap into the trash, and went straight to my apartment. Before the sun set that evening, I went completely no contact. I blocked my mother's number, my father's number, and Trevor's number. I deleted my personal social media accounts, severed ties with distant relatives who served as information conduits, and moved 3 states away to begin my surgical residency. For 15 years, the silence from my end was absolute. 15 years can do wonders for your soul. In those 15 years, I built a life of staggering success, total independence, and profound internal peace. I climbed the surgical hierarchy at one of the top trauma centers in the country. I bought a beautiful home overlooking the city, established a brilliant network of loyal colleagues, and built a reputation as a surgeon who never flinched under pressure. I never looked back. I buried the memories of my childhood deep, beneath the demands of my profession. Unbeknownst to me, however, cosmic justice was quietly writing its own script 300 miles away. Free from my quiet, stabilizing presence, my parents had poured every single cent of their savings and retirement funds into enabling Trevor's increasingly chaotic life. They funded his failed luxury car rental business, paid off his massive credit card debts, and bought him a lavish condo he couldn't afford. Trevor grew into an entitled, incompetent adult who treated my parents like personal bank accounts. By the time my parents reached their late 60s, their savings were completely drained, their credit was ruined, and Trevor had abandoned them the moment the money ran dry, moving to another state and ignoring their calls. I knew none of this on that freezing Tuesday night in the trauma bay. The red emergency phone on the wall rang at precisely 8:14 p.m. The charge nurse, Sarah, picked it up, took frantic notes, and turned to me with a pale face. "Dr. Elaine, we have a code red double arrival coming in 5 minutes. Rollover accident on the icy highway. 2 elderly unrestrained passengers. High-velocity impact. The driver lost control on the black ice." She handed me the incoming paramedic telemetry sheet. I looked down at the clipboard. Arthur, age 72. Severe thoracic blunt trauma, internal hemorrhage, suspected pelvic fracture. Evelyn, age 69. Traumatic head injury, crushed femur, unstable vitals. The nurse looked up at me, sensing the sudden, unnatural stillness that had settled over my frame. "Do you know these patients, Dr. Elaine? We can route them to another attending if there's a conflict of interest." I stared at those 2 names, the names of the people who had abandoned me on a concrete porch 15 years ago, the people who had left 2 empty chairs in the front row of my graduation. I felt a cold, crystal-clear calm wash over my entire body. The hurt, desperate girl inside me was long dead. Standing in her place was an elite surgical expert who held complete control over the room. "I know them," I said, my voice steady, cold, and devoid of any emotional tremor. "Prep trauma bays 1 and 2. Activate the blood bank for mass transfusion protocols. Call down orthopedic surgery and neuro consults immediately." Before we continue with the climax of what happened when my parents opened their eyes in those hospital beds, take a moment to follow my story until the end and comment the city or country you are watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. What would you have done if the people who abandoned you suddenly landed on your operating table? 2 minutes later, the double doors of the trauma bay burst open. The paramedics wheeled the gurneys in under a flurry of frantic shouts, beeping monitors, and bloody blankets. My father was semi-conscious, groaning in agony, his face covered in lacerations and road grit. My mother was unconscious, a neck collar stabilizing her spine, oxygen mask strapped tightly over her pale, bruised face. I stepped into the center of trauma bay 1, my blue surgical gown tied tight, my face partially covered by a surgical mask and clear eye shield. I didn't hesitate. I didn't allow personal history to compromise medical precision. For the next 3 hours, I led the surgical team with clinical, terrifying perfection. When my father began crashing due to a ruptured spleen and massive abdominal bleeding, I opened his abdomen myself, located the spurting vessel in under 90 seconds, and clamped it with surgical mastery. When my mother's blood pressure plummeted in the adjacent bay, I directed the chest tube placement, stabilized her lung collapse, and handed her off to the neurosurgical team for intracranial pressure monitoring. I saved both of their lives before midnight. By 4:00 a.m., Both of my parents were stabilized and moved to the intensive care unit. They were placed in adjacent private rooms separated by a glass partition, hooked up to heart monitors, IV drips, and surgical drains. I completed my rounds, signed the surgical notes, and walked into my father's room just as the morning light began to streak through the blinds. My father was the first to fully wake up. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented and clouded with pain medication. He looked around the sleek, high-tech ICU room, taking in the state-of-the-art monitors and the quiet luxury of the facility. Then his eyes drifted to the figure standing at the foot of his bed. I stood tall in my white chief attending coat, my name embroidered in bold black thread over my heart. Dr. Elaine, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I removed my mask slowly. My father blinked hard, his dry lips parting in absolute shock. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his weathered, bruised face. "Elaine," he croaked, his voice raw and raspy. Is that really you?" "It is, Arthur," I said, keeping my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my lab coat. My voice was level, clinical, completely detached from any warmth or hatred. Through the glass partition, my mother began to stir. A nurse adjusted her oxygen mask, and within moments her eyes swept across the room and landed on me. She gasped, tears immediately welling in her swollen eyes. "Elaine! Oh my God, Elaine, my daughter! My baby girl," she sobbed, her voice trembling through the intercom system. "You're here, you're a doctor." "I have been a doctor for 15 years, Evelyn," I replied calmly. "You would know that if you had attended my graduation instead of driving Trevor to a baseball game." The silence that fell over the ICU room was suffocating. My father tried to shift in his bed, groaning from his surgical incision. "Elaine, please, we didn't know. We tried to find you. Trevor took everything from us. He ran away with our savings. We have nothing left. The insurance company isn't going to cover this entire hospital stay. We're facing total financial ruin." My mother began weeping hysterically from her bed. "Elaine, you have to help us. Look at you, you're the head of this hospital. You're rich. You can fix our bills, you can take us in. We are your parents. Blood is thicker than water." I walked slowly to the side of my father's bed. I didn't lean down. I stood at my full height, looking down at them with absolute, unshakable dignity. "Blood does not make you family," I said, every word dropping like a heavy iron weight onto the cold floor. "Blood just makes you related. 15 years ago, you threw me away like trash because you thought Trevor was your future. You left 2 empty chairs in the front row of the biggest day of my life. You treated me like an invisible ghost when I needed a family." I pulled a pen from my pocket and signed the final discharge care outline on the tablet mounted to the wall. "Tonight, I did my job," I continued, looking my father dead in the eye. "I performed a 4-hour emergency operation and saved both of your lives. I gave you back your breath, your hearts, and your futures. That was my duty as a physician. But as your daughter, that girl died on the concrete steps of my medical school 15 years ago." My father's jaw trembled. Tears slipped down his bruised cheeks. "Elaine, please, don't leave us like this. We have nowhere to go. We have no money. My social work team will assist you with government aid applications and transfer you to a state-run rehabilitation facility once you are stable enough to travel," I said smoothly. "That is the extent of my care." I turned on my heel and walked toward the glass sliding doors. My mother pounded her hand weakly against her bedrail, crying out my name, begging for forgiveness, begging for financial help, begging for a second chance. I stopped at the doorway, turned back one final time, and looked at the 2 people who had spent my entire youth making me feel small. "You spent my whole life making sure I knew I didn't belong at your table," I said with a soft, genuine smile. "Now I own the entire hospital. Enjoy your recovery." I walked out of the ICU, the heavy sliding doors sealing shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of their desperate pleas. I walked down the long, sunlit corridor of my hospital, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire existence. I didn't seek revenge through malice or cruelty. I achieved the ultimate victory by becoming so completely successful, so emotionally unbothered, and so fiercely independent that their absence no longer had any power over me. I saved their lives, paid my debt to humanity, and protected my peace permanently. Now I'm curious about you who are listening to my story. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have taken them in and paid their medical bills, or would you have walked away just like I did? Drop a comment below and make sure to share your thoughts. Thank you for watching until the very end.